Hi, people. This is a little bit spontaneous, but I'm going to do a very brief, very outlined review of The Crown Season 5, i.e., the last broadcast series of The Crown on Netflix. And very much in keeping with the video I made not long ago. This is just my opinion. I'm not saying everyone has to agree or disagree. It's just my opinion. It's subjective, right? Um, but I kind of feel compelled to make this because I've noticed that a lot of people who are big fans of The Crown have expressed disappointment in that series. And one running theme that I've noticed is that it lacks the style of the first few seasons. And this is an interesting critique. Let me just say from the outset, I like season 5. I like The Crown as a program. I think it's superb. I think it's no exaggeration to say it's one of the best period dramas I've ever seen. Maybe the best. Excuse me, I'm just going to put the phone on mute so it's not disturbing this flow. Um, what's going on? Yeah. Um, so, go off mute. Excuse me. Yeah. So that's the main critique that seemed to be a running theme. That it lacks a style, it lacks that big grand style that the first seasons had. The Crown was well known for its very attention to detail, very resplendent sort of sets. It's almost, I would say, it's almost comparable to Stanley Kubrick films. If you look at Stanley Kubrick films, the sets were exquisite. They were, there was real attention to detail, and I think that's also true of The Crown. Um, but I think one people are overlooking in the critique of this series is that The Crown is about a reign, the longest reign of a queen ever. Um, so it goes through a long period of time. It starts off in the late 1940s with the young Princess Elizabeth, and it goes up to this point to the 1990s, and it's probably going to go the whole way through a reign, I would imagine. I'd be surprised at this point if they don't go to the end of her reign with season 6 coming out. Who knows? But I think each season has episodes that stand out more than others. I'm not going to say all episodes are of similar quality. I think they all look like mini films in their own rights, and they all have something about them. I haven't watched a single episode yet that I would honestly say is boring. However, some do stand out more than others. Um, I think it's always difficult for the actors filling the roles because by the end of any particular season, the actors in that season have kind of become, the viewers have become accustomed to them. So then it's like, oh, who are the new people now? And I think it's difficult. So especially for Imelda Staunton playing the Queen, the lead role. Um, but actually in season 5, ironically, the Queen's role in that season was somewhat pushed back a little bit compared to the previous seasons. And I'm not sure if she quite had the same screen presence as Claire Foy or Olivia Colman. And don't forget, Olivia Colman was, there was cynicism about her when she first took on the role. Now she's rightly regarded as one of Britain's finest actresses. Likewise, Imelda Staunton's a prominent and respected British actress, but I think that has to be taken into consideration. Each season of The Crown looks at a different era. So, of course, it's going to feel different because this latest season, season 5, reflects the 1990s. The 1990s for the British monarchy was not the same as the 1950s for the British monarchy. So it's going to be a different feeling. And I think the series actually got that well. Um, if I had any critique, I think there was a little bit too much about Charles and Diana. It was a little bit dominated by that. I think 8 or 7 out of the 10 episodes were about Charles and Diana, so it was a little bit heavy on that. But and along with Imelda Staunton, the other actors were Jonathan Pryce as the Duke of Edinburgh, or Prince Philip then, Edward the new Duke of Edinburgh. Um, Jonathan, excuse me, Johnny Lee Miller as John Major. Now, I think he looked the part. I don't think he quite got the voice right, but that's perhaps nitpicking. He looked the part. And that was a surprise when it was cast because this is Johnny Lee Miller, sick boy from Trainspotting, as the rather demure grey man of politics, John Major. But I think the voice wasn't quite right, but I think he done okay. Dominic West as Prince Charles and Elizabeth Debicki as Diana were the main roles. Um, but there's one episode in particular that stands out, and I want to talk a little bit about it because I found it the most powerful episode of the season, but also the most powerful episode, or one of the most powerful, I should say, overall. By the way, I'm talking a little bit in retrospect here because I burned through the whole thing in the end of 2022. So this is quite a late review. I just felt the need to make it in response to some of these critiques. So the episode I'm talking about is Ipatiev House. Now, if you've watched the season, you'll know the episode I'm talking about. Because I'm into history, I knew immediately what this was about. When I heard the name Ipatiev House, I thought that rings a bell. That's the house where the Romanovs were killed. So I really wanted to see that episode because the Romanovs have always interested me, like as far back as I remember. Last night, I finished this book by the British historian Helen Rappaport, Ekaterinburg. It's an excellent book. I really like her style of writing. You know, a lot of historians have quite cumbersome, or how can I put it, long-winded style. With Helen Rappaport, at least based on this, it's very readable. You know, it's comprehensive, it's well researched, but it's very readable. Um, and one thing that struck me finishing this off last night was, and then thinking back on the episode, I watched that clip again of the opening scene. The attention to detail, it's probably the most accurate depiction of the regicide of the Romanovs I've ever seen on screen, and I've seen a few other depictions. There was the 1996 Rasputin's Dark Servant of Destiny with Alan Rickman. There was Alexander and, excuse me, Nicholas and Alexandra. And, you know, it's a famous event, so it's been on screen a number of times. But how do you depict such a brutal act on screen? It's not easy. Well, I think the way the Crown portrayed it was the right balance because they didn't gloss over what happened, and yet they didn't make it so gruesome as to be just repellent. Now, if you ever manage to read this book, Ekaterinburg, um, Helen Rappaport really goes into the details, and it's utterly sickening. I mean, what should have taken, I'll just lay this out briefly because I think it is important to how that was portrayed on screen. What should have taken 30 seconds by an experienced professional firing squad was completely botched. It took about 20 minutes. Because of the smoke in the small room, the assassins couldn't see properly, so they were choking. The Romanovs did not have a quick death. Nicholas himself probably died quickest, but the women really suffered. The servant suffered. You know, these were not quick deaths. And what the episode shows is little details. For example, the way they came down the stairs in that order, that's actually the order of precedence. It's just a force of habit. And the really harrowing scene with the Grand Duchesses, these young women were huddling in the corner for their lives and they were basically bayoneted to death. Horrendous, horrendous stuff. Apparently, two of the Bolsheviks who were assigned to this task, they got cold feet at the last minute. They refused to kill the girl, so they had the Yukovsky, who was in charge of this thing, had to reassign it. But the whole thing was botched. The men who were assigned to take away the bodies were blind drunk. Um, they wanted to get all of this done in the dead of night, but it went on to the daylight hours when local peasants started getting nosy. It just the whole thing was a mess. And you know, the way the bodies were basically, I won't go into too many gory details, but you know, they were showing absolutely zero respect. It was a truly um, horrendous thing. Now, this is not to gloss over Nicholas's record as a monarch. He was a very flawed monarch. He was weak. He was too indecisive. He was not in tune with what was going on in Russia. Um, but aside from all of that, ultimately he was a loving father and a family man, and it's hard not to. It's very hard not to be moved by that. I think even the murderers were physically sick after what they'd done. But anyway, to get back to the Crown, I think they handled it as well as could be done, and it sort of juxtaposed George V's hunting party, which is probably artistic license. We don't know exactly what he was doing at the exact moment that it happened, given the time difference. It would have been evening probably in the UK, but actually the episode starts off with the British royal families, you know, being given information about whether or not they should get Nicholas out. In fact, other royal families in Europe, the Germans, the Danes, there was sort of communications and some half-hearted attempts by all the monarchies of Europe to do something on behalf of Nicholas, but in the end, there was simply a lack of willpower. And there's a whole big story about uh, how much did George know, how much will did he have to get Nicholas out, and that was heavily featured in the episode. But I cite that episode to show that the Crown is as powerful as ever. I mean, to me, I put that episode honestly up there with the Aberfan episode, and with a few others that to me really stand out. Now, within the season, other episodes include there was a whole thing on the Al Fayeds and Muhammad Al Fayed's rise to prominence. And I think that's significant because that's setting up for his future clashes with the royal family. So it was an interesting episode. Some people might say, oh, a whole episode about him, but actually, I think it has significance. Um, and as ever with The Crown, attention to detail is incredible. Um, the Charles and Diana episodes, one of the big critiques of this was it was going to completely trash the king. And I know that Charles himself and the royal family were nervous about this season. Actually, I don't think it vilified Charles at all. I think it was quite balanced. Now, I'm not going to say that they got everything absolutely spot on. Ultimately, it is a dramatization, it's not a documentary. So The Crown isn't going to get everything absolutely spot on. And I know at the time there were some actors, including Judi Dench, who were quite vocal about that. But um, as actors, they should know that it is a fictional portrayal, and I don't agree that it vilified then Prince Charles. In fact, in the episode, we're showing him and Diana having this back and forth sort of media war, so to speak, rival biographies. Um, it actually focused on Charles setting up the Prince's Trust and the good work he done with that, helping literally millions of youngsters into a better life. So I don't think it was just presenting Charles as an ogre and Diana as a saint. Not at all. I think it actually got quite a good balance. I mean, I didn't come out of that thinking, "Oh, Charles, what a terrible man." I thought this is a complex and flawed marriage with two people who clearly are not meant for each other. That was my feeling. Um, what else? The last episode I liked, the handover of Hong Kong, which was passed to Charles actually as a sort of, I guess, test of kingship. That was a good episode. I'm interested in the history of it. Um, so all in all, I think the critique of season five is a little bit unfair. Um, yes, there is a different feel about it. By the way, that Ipatiev House episode was a big focus on the Queen's relationship with Yeltsin again. This is something that stands out. You can't really say that's like any other episode in the whole program. But I think that people who are criticizing this, they need to consider that it's going to have a different feel from the crown of the 1950s and 60s because the monarchy itself had changed, the country had changed, everything had changed. So it's going to have a different feel. You're going to have an older monarch, you're going to have more cynicism. Um, is it the best season? Maybe not, but honestly, I think the Crown is very adept at kind of moving with how the monarchy moved, and you can't have the same kind of optimistic, glossy feel as that early monarchy because that's not what it was. So I just think it's an excellent program. I think highly of it, and I know that people in politics and the acting world were quite critical of it, but I think they're being a bit unfair. And I totally understand why the king would be nervous and why the royal family would be uncomfortable. If it's about them, of course, they're going to be nervous as the subjects. But if they ever watch it, which I doubt, they would see actually it doesn't vilify Charles. I don't think it's doing that. So I'll look forward to season six. Obviously, Diana's death's going to be a big thing. Again, there's been criticism that that's going to be portrayed, but to be quite honest, I don't know how they can portray it. I mean, I hope they're not don't overly sensationalize it and make it too in your face, but it was a major event in the history of the Windsors, so I don't think you could just pretend it didn't happen and sort of gloss it over. Crown is ultimately a dramatization. It is not a documentary series, but I personally think it is superb at what it does. It's the best. I'll just say it's the best period drama I've ever seen, and I don't think Series 5 quite deserves the criticism that it got. You know, I've seen people write comments like, oh, I'm utterly disappointed by this season. Like, I'm thinking, well, what exactly did you expect? You're going to have different actors, you're going to have a different atmosphere. I don't know how they could have done it differently, really. So personally, this is just my opinion. I think it was superb as always. Some episodes stand out more than others, but for me, Ipatiev House so sad, so moving. And as with again another thing with the Crown, it's a soundtrack. I'm not sure what that piece of music is called. Kind of had a Slavic sort of sound to it, but with the opening scene of Ipatiev House, very sad. Um, if you haven't watched The Crown before, basically, if you didn't know, it's chronicling the history of Queen Elizabeth II's reign and the personal issues in her family. And it's known for its grand set designs and attention to detail. So check it out if you have Netflix. Unfortunately, it is only available on Netflix. So I remember when I didn't have Netflix, the frustration of not being able to watch things, but I do now. So. Yes, that's my verdict. I think season 5, yeah, slightly different feeling. And again, the reason I'll just close with this. I think the reason why Imelda Staunton as the Queen was slightly pushed back as compared to previous seasons is because Charles and Diana, although I think there was maybe slightly too much attention on them in that season, they were getting more prominent. So I think the season was just reflecting that. Um, because by the 90s, the Queen was sort of a settled monarch in some ways. I don't mean in terms of her personal anxieties and her personal, the famous Annus Horribilis, but it was well into her reign at that point, about halfway through, in fact, just over halfway through. So actually, there were fewer stories about the Queen in the 90s than there were about some of the people around her. So I think that's why there was a slight stepping back in that sense. Okay, let me know your thoughts.